In our first video on the SWS, we talked a bit about the struggles of getting a promotion that's got a bit more American-style sports entertainment involved in the mix off the ground in Japan. SWS had their partnership with WWF, but it didn't particularly work out for them. A lot of folks like The Undertaker came over but didn't exactly do much. That's not a knock on Taker, of course, it's just that they didn't really fit in. But The Undertaker may well have done a lot better in the promotion we're looking at today. If the SWS was a promotion that dipped their toes in the sports entertainment water, Hustle was different. They jumped right into the ocean with it, perhaps the most sports entertainment promotion in the history of Japanese wrestling, one where the focus was far more on dramatic and indeed very silly stories as opposed to quality wrestling matches. Hell, some of the promotion's biggest stars were barely even trained. And you know what? For a chunk of their existence, it actually worked. Unlike the stories of SWS and our third promotion, World Japan, the story of Hustle isn't one that's largely defined by nothing except failure. Hustle were very successful indeed at points, and while what they did wasn't exactly to everybody's taste, even the most stone-faced Puro watchers couldn't help but be intrigued by just what was going on over there. In the West, at least. They had plenty of big stars on the roster and a fair bit of money to play with, helped somewhat by a parent company that was doing gangbusters in the world of MMA. There wasn't ever a question as such that the Hustle style would be taken up by any of the other big Puro companies, but it definitely had its own niche. However, in the end, a whole mass of controversy surrounding said parent company, alongside a big deal of misfortune and bad management, would take them down. So let's have a look at one of Puro's stranger promotions. A nostalgic trip back to the world of Hustle. The man, indeed the legend, who defines most of Hustle's existence is one we've covered before, Nobuhiko Takada. Takada was a disciple of the almighty Akira Maeda, and in the 90s he had some big successes at the top of his own shoot-style promotion, the UWFI. He wasn't particularly averse to doing some shady things to earn his reputation either, such as when he hilariously double-crossed both Trevor Berbick and Koji Kitao. That aside, the man was a brilliant shoot-style wrestler. His work against big gaijin beasts like Vader and Gary Albright, or contemporaries like Maeda, Kiyoshi Tamura and Kazuo Yamazaki? Absolutely magic. If you ever watched the international Bushido broadcasts of old UWFI matches back in the 90s on Eurosport or whatever, you might be familiar with some of it already. It certainly still holds up. Following the disbanding of the UWFI in the mid-90s, Takada suddenly finds himself involved in the world of MMA. Again, we've covered these events. Verbal jaw-jacking in the press about the possibility of fighting Rickson Gracie suddenly leads to UWFI wrestler Yoji Unjo turning up at Hickson's gym in California for a fight and getting the piss beaten out of him. And now, well, Takada's kinda got to respond properly in the ring, even though he himself, despite his skill at pro wrestling, is not a skilled mixed martial artist at all. Despite this, he has 2 matches with Hickson. He loses both, and Hickson was kinda told to go easy on him, but in a way, it evens up the score. Both Takada-Hickson matches headline 2 of the earliest cards in the history of what is still undoubtedly Japan's most famous MMA promotion, Pride, who are won by a company called Dreamstage Entertainment. Even though Takada is barely an MMA fighter, these matches with Rickson Gracie are massive deals, and they were instrumental in establishing the initial success and popularity of Pride as an MMA company. The same applies for various other matches he had, his bouts against fellow pro wrestlers such as Kiyoshi Tamura and Alexander Otsuka, or the one that he won against Mark Coleman. Of course, I say won, but Takada's wins were not exactly on the up and up, due to reasons previously mentioned. Mark Coleman was paid a pretty handsome chunk of money to job to Takada, and the bouts against the likes of Otsuka are pure grain shoot style. But even though the presence of Takada was hardly pleasing for the MMA purists, one wonders where Pride would have been without him. He generated a lot of interest and money for Dreamstage in various fights. He'd generally lose badly in any non-fixed fight against the likes of Igor Vochanchin and Mark Kerr, with the exception of a draw against Mirko Krokop. a draw that was earned using tactics pulled right out of the Antonio Inoki book. He stayed firmly on the ground through almost all of the fight, not simply because he broke his own foot halfway through, and took advantage of a round system that was certainly in his favour, and there not being any judges or point system. So, what's next? Well, despite retiring from MMA and being inactive in the world of pro wrestling, he still wanted to be involved with Dream Stage. And so, after a couple of years out, he resurfaced in 2004 at the head of a brand new promotion. And that was, of course, Hustle. Hustle was the brainchild of Takada and DSE president Nobuhiko Takada, and initially was a cross-promotion with pro wrestling company 01. It began with an angle where Sakikabara and Takada both badmouthed wrestling at a press conference, proclaiming MMA's superiority, and then 01's Naiwa Ogawa flipped a table over and came to pro wrestling's defence. It's kind of funny that this job would fall to Ogawa, the legit Olympic-level judoka who is perhaps most famous for the shoot against Shinya Hashimoto that signalled the birth of Inokiism in New Japan. Although that incident didn't stop Ogawa and Hashimoto forming a strong partnership, which led to the creation of Hashimoto's 01. Anyway, from this we get the first Hustle card. 12,000 filed into the Saitama Super Arena on January 4th, 2004, the usual home of a lot of Pride cards, to watch Ogawa's crew of pro wrestlers go up against Takada's group of MMA fighters, later dubbed the Monster Army. There's odd spectacles such as the late Kevin Randleman and the Predator Sylvester Terkay, remember him, WWE CW fans, teaming up for a tag victory, the appearance of pro wrestler turned MMA fighter Giant Silver, Mark Coleman eating another defeat to a pro wrestler against the almighty Toshiaki Kawada, and a big main event where Naiwa Ogawa loses in a total sports entertainment cluster schmaz of a match against a highly successful pro wrestler with a pseudo MMA gimmick. That being, of course, Bill Goldberg. Was it a success? No. In a pretty ballsy and, in retrospect, thoroughly idiotic move, the first Hustle show ran directly against traditionally the biggest pro wrestling supercard of the year, New Japan's annual 4th January Wrestling World Tokyo Dome show, which, by way of comparison, pulled an audience of 53,000 fans into the Big Egg. The equivalent of, I don't know, let's say if AEW had decided to run their first ever show against frickin' WrestleMania. That's what DSE tried to do. Needless to say, the New Japan show absolutely blew out Dream Stage's effort, and reviews for Hustle's first show were not good to the point where people wondered what 01 were doing getting involved with them. Early predictions for the venture's fortunes were negative, to say the least. And yet, considering that this was perhaps the peak time for MMA's popularity in Japan, the New Japan Dome show was also very MMA-centric, there was perhaps still some potential here despite the lousy start. I mean, it has to be said that the mixture of pro wrestling and MMA wasn't exactly new. You've got Inokiism, of course, as well as Maeda's Rins, which often featured proper martial artists in shoot-style bouts, not to mention all the other shoot-style promotions. And then you've also got the niche success of promotions like Battle Arts, who would explore this big styles clash even further, featuring the likes of Bas Rutten, say, in tag matches. Now that seems really strange on paper, but it kind of worked when they did it. The MMA guys on Hustle's first cards were sort of smart, at least. Both Mark Coleman and Kevin Randleman had done a fair bit of pro wrestling over the years, although it didn't necessarily make them that capable in the squared circle. So initially what you've got is something that's a lot like Battle Arts, but on a bigger scale and of course with a greatly inferior product. Comparing early Hustle to Battle Arts is very generous indeed, let's make that clear. However, in the ensuing years, Hustle would go much more into a sports entertainment direction, basically starting from the second show where Takada introduced his new character. Enter Generalissimo Takada. Dressed in dictatorial uniform at the head of his monster army, often chomping a huge cigar, looking like a real-life M. Bison or, perhaps more accurately, the fictional character Yasunori Kato, a similarly imposing dictator capable of superhuman powers. Takada himself rarely wrestled. If he did, it was normally as an old friend of his called the Esperanza, who just so happened to look the same as Generalissimo Takada, or even as a cyborg version of himself. but he would be the central character and top heel in Hustle throughout virtually the entirety of the promotion's run. Does this help initially? Not really. The reception for Hustle and 01's shows in 2004 continued to be miserable. Bill Goldberg was certainly not worth whatever ridiculous amount of money it cost to take him on. While he was initially set to make a series of appearances that would build up to a big match against either Hashimoto or Kawada, a hand injury followed by a retirement put paid to all of that. Total waste of money. DSE signed up both the Outsiders, Kevin Nash and Scott Hall, as well as Mick Foley to one-off appearances for Hustle's third show on May the 8th, but they did it right at the last minute. So this trio cost loads of money and had zero effect on the show's audience or buy rate. Still, if you ever wanted to see what Toshiaki Kawada vs Cactus Jack would have looked like in a big setting, well, here's your chance. Efforts to sign or even start negotiations with Stone Cold Steve Austin go nowhere fast, and the same applies to efforts at bringing in Hulk Hogan, although at least the failure to bring in Hogan saved everybody from one of the only things that could have made a 2004 Hustle show worse: a Brooke Hogan gig. Massive gaijin lugs like Dan Bobish and Matt Ghaffari are pushed in the main event and wrestle nothing but stinkers against folks like Ogawa who aren't particularly good themselves. Audience numbers and show quality remain appallingly low despite the eventual striking up of a TV deal later in the year. Most of 2004 sees Hustle do basically nothing but lose lots of money, and people wonder just how long Dream Stage intend to keep it going for, just how much more money they're willing to drop into it. Virtually the only success they had at all, weirdly, was with Naoya Ogawa having a pop hit with a song called Hustle Hustle that featured in commercials and had a cute dance and the like. And as for 01, well, the cross-promotion with Hustle was one of the things that essentially killed them. With the company running deep in the red, founder, wrestling legend and basically Puro Promotion's only real draw, Shinya Hashimoto, left under a cloud in November, chased out by his own excessive spending, and the original 01 folded straight after, although 01 Max formed almost immediately from its ashes, keeping the line going. Hustle's 2004, their first year, was, put bluntly, dreadful. There's less successful years than this one that have flat out killed other promotions. Let's put it that way. If it weren't for Dream Stage's hefty bank balance, they would have been dead in the water very quickly. So, does it get any better? Well, actually it does. As the mid-2000s roll on, Hustle does start to find success. However, to do so, it has to go further and further away from wrestling. Bluntly put, Hustle didn't get over at all with Japanese wrestling fans. They mostly despised it. It did, however, get over somewhat with non-wrestling fans, mainly thanks to the introduction, through 2005, of people outside the business. Enter the likes of Izumi Motoya, the famed Kogen actor, or Yinling, the erotic terrorist, famous model and sinner. And of course, Razor Ramon Hardgay. Real name Masaki Sumitani, the wastely dressed comedian became one of the promotion's biggest stars, basically their top face, attracting lots of mainstream attention for the company. Certainly hiring these names that were outside of wrestling completely proved to be much more profitable than hiring big names from wrestling itself. Doing these things allowed Hustle to finally run successful pay-per-views and supercards in a generally miserable commercial time for pro res. Just about everyone was struggling in 2005. Noah were perhaps the only stable company, New Japan was dreadful, All Japan was at death's door, most of the Joshi promotions were dead already, indies were going down, and yet here's Hustle, with big shows and cards getting lots of attention. Things like this probably only made Japanese wrestling fans hate them even more. In their eyes, Hustle and, by extension, Dream Stage were doing more to kill the wrestling business than they were doing to help it. It's kind of funny, mind. I mean, it's not like Hustle wasn't created by big wrestling fans. Hell, their writing was so nerdy and chock full of insider wrestling references, especially in the early days, that you kinda had to be a big wrestling fan to get a lot of what they were referring to. The nuances in the script, if you will. Anywho, as we reach the end of 2005, Hustle is moving well. The attention they'd gotten meant their pay-per-views like Hustle Mania, the biggest show on their calendar, could get respectable buy rates, and now they could pull fine numbers in decently sized arenas without papering half of the bloody crowd like they'd done before. It's all good. Mind you, what did we, the smart marks from that big entity known as the IWC, who read the Observer, listen to Figure 4 Weekly, and follow all the Puro goings-on and that, think about them in the West? I suppose that generally we were probably a bit more receptive to Hustle than the hardcore Japanese wrestling fans were, although it perhaps depended a bit on where you were in the internet wrestling community. The more serious Smark, the one who's purely about match quality and really doesn't have much love for sports entertainment, your Scott Keith's Blog of Doom type crowd, pretty sure they bloody hated Hustle as much as the Japanese Smarks did. Back in the mid-2000s, I largely spent my time on the Death Valley Driver video review forums, which was a much more ironic Smark sort of place. We loved good wrestling, but we loved silly shit and sports entertainment too. So I think we were a fair bit more receptive, more into the kooky and weird nature of it all, and this promotion sure could get weird. We are after all talking about a wrestling soap opera where, just for example, Yinling gives birth to a giant monster who happens to be played by Akebono, they eventually end up having a match, and Akebono accidentally kills Yinling, his mother, with a splash. That's kind of where we're at. Some of us may have been dismayed at seeing an all-time great like Toshiaki Kawada playing Monster K and generally goofing off, while others may have been more appreciative of the surreal madness they were witnessing. For about a year or so, Hustle enjoyed some success and actual positive notoriety. But success is, of course, fleeting, and it's pretty easy to point out the big event where it all went drastically wrong. At the start of June 2006, things looked pretty good for Hustle. Their weird product was still gaining popularity, to the point where on 18th of June, highlights of their big Hustle-Aid pay-per-view were set to air on Fuji TV, the major broadcasting network who were also showing Pride broadcasts nationwide. Pride 2 was hugely on the rise, set to make their big American debut later in the year. On June the 5th, Dreamstage president Nobuhiko Takada has a routine meeting with Fuji TV executives and all seemingly goes well, and then just a couple of hours later, a Fuji network lawyer showed up at Takada's door with a notice saying that, effective immediately, Fuji TV was cancelling its contract with Dreamstage Entertainment and that they would never air Pride, Hustle, or indeed anything the company produced ever again. Indeed, Fuji clarified further that they would never again work with anyone who remained involved with DSC in any capacity. How quickly things change. There was always shady rumours bubbling under with Dreamstage, claims that the company was actually a front for Yamaguchi Gumi, Japan's largest Yakuza organisation. These allegations gained weight when a weekly tabloid news magazine, Shukan Jendai, started running attack articles on them on an almost constant basis in 2006, alleging all manner of DSE employees' involvement in crime, and it appears that the heat became way too much for the Fuji network, hence their very sudden shift in stance. Seeing as Fuji was DSE's main broadcast partner and sponsor, well, Fuji's termination of their contract was a truly crushing, catastrophic blow. DSC made noise about suing Shukan Jendai on grounds of slander, although nothing came of that, and, well, while Dreamstage didn't immediately implode, this whole incident was basically like being lung shot. You're fully conscious, but you know that the bullet is fatal, that your lungs are slowly filling with blood, that you're eventually going to suffocate, and that absolutely nothing can be done to save your life. A big Pride event on July the 1st sold out the Saitama Super Arena, their home ground, with well over 10,000 paid, and absolutely no one in Japanese media reported on it except the minor cable specialist fighting channels. Pride, Hustle and virtually anything Dreamstage was now blacklisted, irregardless of how much truth there was in these allegations. The ultimate fate of Pride is well known, of course. The UFC's parent company Zuffa bought them in 2007, a move that pretty much signalled the end of Dreamstage Entertainment as a company. Hustle, now away from DSC and greatly reduced, lasted a couple of years longer, although they never made nearly as much noise. Surprisingly, perhaps, Ramon stuck around the company despite very much being advised by his management not to. While doing so undoubtedly hurt his mainstream career to no end, it was a decision perhaps made out of loyalty and in respect of the impact Hustle had on his career in the first place. Takada and others would also stick around, and there'd still be plenty of wrestling talent like Kawada appearing intermittently, or more consistent talent like Yoshihiro Tajiri or Yoji Anjo, remember him. Still, Hustle for its last couple of years is kind of a zombie. In the summer of 2009, Generalissimo Takada finally decides to end his presence in the company with a typically extravagant storyline, and Ramon HG's in-ring career comes to an abrupt end when he shatters his foot in an accident. That's another welcome 1-2 gut shot for an already flagging company. The company's new president, Nobuo Yamaguchi, announces in August of 2009 that Hustle is going to enter a new era that would take them away from the fighting opera sports entertainment style and towards a more traditional pro-res style. But it's kind of all a smokescreen, a way to desperately try and get some more attention. It had after all been many months since the promotion had made any kind of money. It didn't work. Just 2 months later, in October, Yamaguchi announced that Hustle would be folding as it could no longer pay its wrestlers or staff. The exit of Takada and Hardgay had basically been the final straw, ending almost all remaining fan interest. Yamaguchi did hope that Hustle could return someday, but outside of a couple of shows won by wrestler and fighter Wataru Sakata, it hasn't happened yet. The spirit did live on somewhat for a couple of years in Tajiri's Smash promotion, although that too didn't last awfully long. Hustle's brand of sports entertainment exists in a very odd place. As kooky as promotions like Dramatic Dream Team can be, a lot of their more comedic stuff has its own place on the card, and mixes in with serious, high-quality wrestling. In recent times, even the big companies have had their little injections of sports entertainment style work, heavy on the storylines. There's lots of it in New Japan with the Bullet Club and all of that, but again, it's paired with top level ring work. Hustle is possibly the only Japanese promotion ever to go all the way towards storyline. Match quality for them was as unimportant as it was for, say, WCW in the Vince Russo era. Even if they did have talented workers on the roster, you won't find anything in the company archives that truly works on its own just as a pure wrestling match. I mean, that's not really the point, to be fair. It was something you either loved or hated. Either you embraced the ridiculousness or rejected it thoroughly. Here in the West, characters like Generalissimo Takada, Yinling the erotic terrorist, and Ramon Hardgay were perhaps a silly meme more than anything else, whereas emotions clearly ran a lot stronger in the Japanese wrestling world. I mean, was it the symbol of everything wrong with Japanese wrestling at a time when it looked like pro-res as a whole was dying, when it looked like MMA was going to swallow it whole? Funnily enough, the DSC scandal actually prevented that. The saga of Hustle is little but a secondary story compared to the scandal being a knife to the heart of MMA's popularity in the country. 14 years later, it's still hard to say just what Hustle's legacy is. There was nothing like it in pro-res beforehand, and nothing afterwards. Although, I do have one kind of thought in my mind. What does it say when a company that is ostensibly a wrestling promotion can get someone over massively to the point of being their top face who literally isn't trained as a wrestler at all? What does that say about Hustle? What does that say about pro wrestling? I mean, I don't think it says anything good, does it? Yeah, it is all very inscrutable. It's as inscrutable perhaps as a model giving birth to a £500 baby. Anyway, join us next week for a pure grain disaster. One company and one utterly wretched year of incompetence, profligacy, and literal death. That company is World Japan. But until then, bye for now.